just wanted to thank everybody for coming and to introduce Jan, who will be our speaker today. As the note said, Jan is now well into doing her doctorate on the conception of simulation as a profession. What will that mean for things like workplace employment, for future studies? But at the moment, what do we mean by simulation as a profession, and who might be involved? So aside from that, Jan, it's over to you. And I think you said you wanted to have lots of conversation with this, so go.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, for handing over. Look, welcome everybody, and I'm very grateful that you've come along. And I guess I will preface what Elizabeth has just kindly stated and say that I wouldn't say I'm well into it. My thought processes are well into it, but I've certainly got a long way to go. And for that reason, I'm very happy to have input and discussion, and certainly that will be most helpful for me. So it's all about me. I would like to, before we start, acknowledge somebody keep coming in and out.
Yeah, there's a few people coming in, so just keep going. Okay. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for the arrivals. We've only just started.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to just acknowledge the lands of in Australia, of the native peoples of Australia, and I really don't have the slide here, so I can't say much more than that other than I'm doing that acknowledgement. I would also like to acknowledge Brian Jolly, Erica Southgate and Elizabeth Lee for their great support on this project, which is an exploring and identifying project. Because and looking at the simulation workforce and developing an understanding of what that means, what is common, if there is anything common across the disciplines, and are there common skills and knowledges and competencies and capabilities, and in particular I'm focusing at this point in time on health, defence, engineering and civil aviation, which may well be too broad, but I'll get to that in a minute. So I have completed a critical review, and I am have a research proposal, and I am developing more clearly a methodology to really nail this down. I have a number of thoughts, but as I said, I'm shamelessly getting some ideas from the crew. It's kind of like a bit more of an unconference style SimCafe. I'm not the founder of all knowledge, and I'm hoping you all are. So, as I said, the major thrust of my review was exploring the simulation workforce, their knowledge and skills, identifying, predicting if there's any transferable roles, and also what sort of credentialing might that look like across the many industries. So the little white square in the center is kind of like this nirvana. Is there such a thing as that? I have not done what you call a literature review, that is a very narrow one, because I did need to look through the grey literature, reports, etc. So it's a very broad area, and some of the materials, as you can imagine with defence, are not quite as easily come by. And so the scoping, the snowballing has been the way that I've had to manage this particular subject matter with the usual search terms, and I'm not going to dwell on that. But there is the overwhelming evidence showed that there is a growing need for simulation, and an increased need for properly trained staff, and that's across the board with all industries. There is also a variation in the meanings of what we mean by simulation and modelling, and that's across the board. And the applications of simulation is also quite varying across the board. So we use different things in different ways for different parts. And I did actually see a very nice little piece, talk and Oren discuss simulation in terms of experience and experiment, which kind of helps, I think, to sort of divide us, or not divide, to maybe explain some of the differences in the ways that we use things. So when we're using simulation, if we're using simulation in particular, say as an education process, then we're really after an experience for our participants. We're really after for them to have a realistic experience so that they can actually progress in their training endeavours, in their thought process, in their reflection. So you see in the healthcare industries, I'll just advance the slides so you can see what I'm seeing. In the healthcare industries and civil aviation and defence, you would see this experiential human nature type experience very heavily. Whereas the experiment part of the process is simulation to work out and predict how to make decisions and predict out how an outcome of what would happen what if. So again, you see that in healthcare, but nowhere near to the degree that, say, engineering. They're far more interested, will this bridge, can I predict if this bridge is actually going to be okay or not? Civil aviation, can I make sure that this blah, blah, blah. Not to say that they couldn't be used across these industries, but at this point, there is definitely a focus that each industry takes, that it goes to an area of where they're most interested. I'm just going to flick up here very quickly. This is, oops, my slides are not doing what I want them to do. In this one, just to let you know that there is actually a curriculum. I fixed that up and it hasn't worked. There is a curriculum in America. Oh, it's annoying when the slides won't do what you want them to do. That I'm just going to see if it'll hold while I do this. No, it's not going to. In America, Florida, where they actually go from cradle from the school right through to doctorate level, and it's all about simulation. And so there is a model that this is already working in the world, but not necessarily across industries. Okay, now it can go and now it won't do it. So to some way, even when we look at a picture of simulation, just an actual simulation, and I put up a health one, we can see that in a simulation we have a perspective. And this is just a theatre perspective, you know, the people in the area, even though they're in the simulation, they can only see from their perspective. Whereas the theatre manager is not even in the simulation, so they can't even actually see what's going on. They can only predict what's going on. So that I feel that if you look at all industries, we're probably in the same way. It's almost like this simulationist word, which says that there's two ways of defining simulationists. There's that theory where we're all living in a simulation, and perhaps in some way we're all living in a simulation, so we don't necessarily see what each other sees, and we don't even know we're in a simulation. Or the other word coined by the healthcare is that we are, as workforce people, simulationists, which is a new word that they're trying to coin. So let's just look at a little bit across the board, and there are some examples from different disciplines that you would think, oh, well, this is a role that we could be doing in simulation. And I guess in the orange square, what's highlighted is that the simulation principles or characteristics of each different area are quite similar. So what we're actually doing, there is evidence that there is similarities rather than disparity, even though the actual discipline examples and the discipline knowledge is quite different. I won't dwell on that because I do want more discussion. And when we look at our common skills and roles, and I think in this audience, I don't need to explain this to you. Well, hopefully I don't. This is a diagram that's quite often seen in the simulation ranks, where we look at the types of simulations from live to virtual to constructive, and how we use them is determined on whether, and I think if I just say whether it's for experience or for experiment. So I can imagine that a constructive simulation is far more experimental than a live, which is far more experiential. Okay, so I think this diagram helps us to stand back and get a little bit of perspective and say, well, in my area, how do I use simulation the most? And do I use all of these types of simulation? And should I be thinking about that maybe this is a use that I should be using in my particular industry because other industries are using some of these that I'm not, for example. So I'm in the health industry, and I would say that constructive is less used, for example, than live or virtual. And I've just superimposed over this slide. So the first slide had some defence examples, and this has just got some health examples to just get some kind of contrast, which allows people to say, oh yes, I can see that there are definitely uses. So that's with the skills and knowledge section, and how we might use them and how it might all fit into an overarching system for simulation skills and knowledge and a particular role. But is there actually credentialing already? Absolutely. There's credentialing everywhere. And the bubbles are just giving just a couple. Between health and engineering and defence, there are all sorts of credentialing methods happening. And yet, at this point, there's nothing across the board, which actually affects very much our portability in our industry. It affects the way that we might be able to cross over and transfer into different industries, even though there seems to be evidence that there are some common shared simulation characteristics across all industries, or at least the 4 that I've had a review of at this point. And thus, you would imagine that I'm sorry, I'm going to rephrase that. If I come back a notch then and look at, say, well, what is a simulation professional? Then we need to just define what a professional is. And some quite old references, excuse me, I've got a cough, suggest that a body of knowledge, responsibility, accountability, ethics, and altruism would be the tenements of a profession, which I guess we all can imagine, well, I'm a professional, I do all those things, but it would be a discrete body of knowledge within the simulation group across different areas, different industries. Oops, I've got this problem again. Sorry. I should have prepared these slides a bit better. This is really annoying, and I'm going to, for that reason, I'm going to have to resort to.
And then just enlarge the screen.
Yeah. It's just very annoying, and I can't do that anymore.
Jan, the slider in the bottom left-hand corner, you can enlarge it with that.
Oops. That's very large now. How about that?
Technology, all the amazing things it can do. And thanks, Marcus.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
It's just the advancing. I've got automatic advances on, and it's just a bit annoying, and I can't take it off without fiddling around, and I don't want to do that. So the gap in knowledge really is this scope of knowledge and skills required across industries. And it potentially, the big issue for us is that it potentially, it does create this dilemma. It creates the dilemma to say, well, you know, is there such a thing as a simulation professional? And if there is, are we using all the skills and knowledge that we should be? And if we are, or even if we potentially could, and that we do, could we actually conceivably transition from one industry to another? And if we do, what sort of training do we actually need to enhance our skills so that we actually can do this transition? So these are questions that we have, and so arising from that, there are 6 main questions. And I'll leave you to read that for a second because I think that would be more useful. I'm assuming you're all good readers. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to actually move on to the next slide. And it just shows for each of those RQ questions the gap against each question. So we've got RQ1, there are different roles and descriptions. RQ2, different knowledge, and how do the industries decide what knowledge and skills are required? Number 3, the knowledge and skills required are cost, that's a gap. Whether there's transferability, RQ4. Is there different credentialing? And there is no single set, and there's no place where credentials currently, no single place where credentials for across the board would be repository. Okay, so that's that part of what I wanted to talk about. And now what I'm actually looking at is a much, this is where you get to help. I'm looking at now how to address those questions in a logical way. And I suggest that there's a number of ways potentially that I could address those questions to get the cleanest and quickest answer. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that I'm going to find these answers easily. And I'm also suggesting that the community of simulation are going to have to be on board. That is my major suggestion. So what I've actually got here is just a quick mud map, which says how I might be able to best find some of this work using each of the different types of methodologies that I feel might be available. And so I've looked at the document search and said, well, you know, that will actually give me the roles, the knowledge and skills. Just looking through job ads, asking industry, common knowledge skills, they should be in a document search. Case studies can potentially have a deeper look, looking at the transferability of roles, credentialing and professionalism. A force skill analysis could help to give weighting. The nominal group technique can potentially answer most questions, as could a Delphi. Okay, let's just go to the next slide. I originally had this as my methodology map. Would I do a nice search of everything and then generate the data, and I do a force field, which means doing case studies and asking you all, you know, what do you think, how do you think this all fits in, and then ending up with a nominal or a Delphi. Or it could be the other way around, where we do a nominal or a Delphi or and then get some kind of weighting. So what I've actually got here is just a couple of things in case anyone is not quite sure. I'm going to start again. Force skill analysis. Please forgive me if I'm teaching how to suck an egg. I don't mean to do that. But a force skill analysis is essentially looking at the current situation and asking people to tell us what are the things that are restraining you from having a simulation professional across different areas, and what are the things that are helping you to do that. So that's one approach. The other one is the nominal group technique, which is assemble your team, open the session, brainstorm, present an idea and record the idea, clarify, prioritise ideas, and go to the next phase. Kind of a more open way of doing a Delphi, and to some degree possibly a little bit quicker, which is the Delphi, get your group together, have some ideas, do an assessment, then feedback and discussion to see what you think, and then reassess and start again to try and get consensus. So both nominal and Delphi are for consensus, whereas the fourth skill is looking more at getting a weighting for that consensus. I'm just sharing with you what my thought process is. In this project management consulting group suggested that the nominal group technique is very much like a Delphi, but easier, essentially. So I'm going to stop for a second because I've got a couple more things, and I just would like to be able to field a few comments from people to perhaps discuss for me, this is the workshop part of it, what your thoughts are on methodology and why, because this is quite a complex project, why what your thoughts are and why you're thinking what you're thinking, if I could.
So do you want them in the chat, Jan, or ask, or both?
Both. Maybe people can talk.
There you go, audience. Let's have some questions. What comes to mind when you're looking at what Jan's saying?
Do you want to see the actual questions?
Yes, please. While you're doing that, I was going to ask a question about the definition of a profession and altruism. Not that I'm disagreeing with it, but what do you understand? What were you meaning by putting that there?
So altruism, I know it seems like you're giving everything up for nothing. Altruism really states to the concept of you've got these knowledge and skills and professional attitudes, and that you're actually prepared to use those in the best way for the community. So it talks to the concept that you're not going to do the wrong thing. You're not trying to do the wrong thing. That's what they define in the professional status what altruism means. It doesn't mean that you're going to just give your services away. It means you're going to do the right thing by people. You've been given these knowledge and skills.
Yeah. In an engineering sense, that comes under the Engineering Australia Code of Ethics, in terms of not misrepresenting your capabilities, not taking on work that you aren't really qualified or experienced in, and all those kinds of things. That's part of their ethics framework.
I think altruism is also the continued perpetuation of the profession.
I think, yeah, that was what I was thinking when I saw that.
So medicals agree to train the next generation as part of their role.
Good question, Phil. I've kind of always just accepted it, but what the two of you and Marcus, what you've said really sort of settles it into why altruism is such a point of it. You've got to give up something of yourself in order to make sure that the next generation actually gets the knowledge. You can't be selfish.
Yeah, and I mean, if we take mentoring as an example of doing that, often you're not actually giving up something of yourself. Yeah, typically, I find mentoring something where you actually get quite a lot back as well.
Yeah.
So is it really altruistic? Well, I think it is, because it is overall, but I think there are definitely benefits from doing that.
Good point.
And I think it having strong mentoring, Phil, doesn't just strengthen your skills and the person you're mentored, it gives the profession a connectivity that is very important for other groups to recognise. So our problem is that other groups struggle to recognise us. And so,
Yes.
Jan, when I look at your questions, I think there are three groups of people you need to consider. The first group of people are those who employ simulation professionals, so heads of industry. And in many cases, they're not going to have strong answers because they have a poor recognition of us as an identity group. The next group would be those amongst us who have actually transferred industry. So there are a lot of people who have transferred industry, defence to health, engineering to defence, defence to aviation. So all the ones you've got there, there are transfers. And then the final group is those that haven't, and in fact aren't interested in transferring, because part of a profession, part of belonging to a group is valuing the entire group. And if you're a healthcare educator and you're not interested in diagnostic simulation, well, how will you support diagnostic simulation if you feel it threatens your educational simulation? So I think it's very important that if you do get your think tanks together, to actually get your three groups as three separate groups and see what the disparity is in their beliefs and their knowledge.
I agree, Marcus, and what you're bringing to mind, which I've not thought about before, is that in some subtle or not so subtle ways, some of Jan's work will actually be involving some education of the various groups around the others. I mean, that's what SimOst is doing a lot of. He's where things connect and interact and so on. But as Jan's doing the research, that's likely to be a hopefully positive and productive spin-off or a clear indicator of barriers to acceptance. I hadn't thought of that. Matt, you've got your hand up. You can speak up anytime. What did you want to add?
I just wondered if it's worth thinking about the flip side of this as well, perhaps a slightly darker side, where if you're looking to establish something like simulation as a profession, you equally run the risk of setting up an exclusive club to which other people then are no longer able to get access to. So if you look around the room and various groups who are involved in simulation, it's often people with an interest. And there are benefits, but there are also downsides and risks to that. And a lot of that is to do with standardization and credibility, validity. So certainly setting up a professional group definitely has benefits. I've seen that happen with, it's currently happening with the pre-hospital medicine group, where they've gone from traditionally emergency physicians, intensivists, anesthetists, and a few others who have wanted to do this, but they've now got their own diploma, and it won't be that long probably before they become a faculty of a number of colleges, and then will probably have their own college of pre-hospital medicine at some point in the future. But in doing so, it becomes a little bit of an exclusive club. There are those who are in and there are those who are not, and there's immediately a barrier. So I just wonder if it's worth exploring that side and the merits and limitations of considering a professionalizing simulation.
Jan?
You're right. It's certainly one of the risks that I've actually put in the last part of the slide that I haven't presented to you. I think that I'll just go to the slide because it's probably easier just to say, because all of this I want to have consideration for. So in my feasibility, I've said that, that acceptance of assessment of commonalities and the size of the work could be too big. So what you're actually suggesting is that it could become to an exclusive club or pushback. Okay, that's
yeah. I'm certainly not saying that it shouldn't be done, but to go down that path, it might be important, if that's the ultimate destination, to make sure that it doesn't become a barrier for others who want to get involved, that the bar doesn't become too high to jump.
Yeah, I'm absolutely, and I think that's one of the important parts of this whole study, is to look at every single part of every single aspect that could be problematic in order to be able to look at those limitations and the benefits, to consider them properly, because it's not, you're not the first person to say that. If we actually make a simulation profession, are we making it so narrow that nobody can get in? Are we actually creating gates and doors that weren't there before? And what I'm thinking is that just from looking at the evidence, that the roles are becoming broader, that there are many more people entering the industry, but it seems that one of the issues at the moment is that the entries are from many different areas, and so that transferability is limited, and the knowledge that that is required to cross is not transparently given to anybody. You have to kind of work it out.
Can I provide an analogy? If we think about teaching, we have a profession around teaching, but children are taught by people without degrees all the time. Simulation will be used by people whether they've got a qualification or not. What the qualification allows is for industry to be able to make better decisions. And I have to say that the professionalism of some people who dabble in simulation is very low, because they don't know what they don't know. And that's a risk for all of us, and it's a risk for their industry's outcomes.
And I think building on that, Marcus, it then also provides a bit of a developmental model for, where people come in without a skill base to improve.
Wow, good, nice observations there. Jan, do you want to add? Well, we sort of haven't talked about your questions or your method yet. Do you want to go back to that? I mean, I think the issues that are coming up are really helpful for you, but.
No, I'm very happy to have this more open discussion, because I think as we add to, I think it's very important for this study that all the limitations and benefits are reviewed as well, because I may have missed critical questions that need to be answered, or at least I might be able to broaden initial questions. Because one of the issues that I'm finding now with the next part of the project is just finding a way through with the methodology. I believe I caught up exactly what Marcus said. If I go and do a document search on industry and have a look at what jobs are out there and what roles are out there, they're either very focused to one industry only, or they look like they've been written by someone in HR who has absolutely no idea what it is that anybody wants. They have no idea what it is that they're going to be doing, which means that we haven't defined our industry at all well. So we're leaving, the profession of simulation. So we're leaving ourselves open to either be the first person's axe, or have our roles so broadly defined that if we are doing something great, but somebody else doesn't think, they can easily say, well, we don't need you anymore, or that's not what you should be doing. And it also leaves us potentially in a position where we aren't necessarily rewarded to the degree that we should be rewarded financially as well. So there's a lot of different things I'm looking at the moment.
I totally agree with that, Jan. The number of simulation people who lost their jobs recently and returned to nursing is amazing. And then people say, oh, they can still do the simulation. But, they've actually got a full-time job nursing. It is, at the moment, an expendable asset in healthcare, and probably a critical one. I do have some questions for your questions. So you've labelled health, defence, engineering and civil aviation. I know you have to limit it to something within a PhD, but there is maritime, there is rail, other forms of transport that are very well developed in simulation. You don't have to bring them in, but I just think you need to acknowledge then, if you're not bringing in the other groups that are well established, that you're assuming that if you can get these four matched, you can then transfer to a broader community. And in fact, along that, you would have to bring in Engineering is a huge one. So it does cover a lot of the simulation in transportation, but civil engineering, a whole range of things there is very different to the simulation used, for example, for mechanical engineering. And across all those assets, it may be quite different. And so one of the things I think would be worthwhile is trying to break it down into the roles that people need. And although you've got education and experimentation, often there overlap. So often we'll run a team-based scenario to find better ways to do things. So it's both educational and experimental. So I tend to think of
it's not education, I'm talking about experience.
Oh, experience. So as interventional, where you want to change something, diagnostic, where you want to understand something, and predictive, where you can't actually look at what you're doing already, you're trying to predict something that's new. And I think those things are very different industries or within industries, and they're very different uses of simulation. So my experience is most healthcare professionals are reasonably good at the interventional ones. They can train people to do things, they can give people experience. They start to struggle at diagnostic and they totally fail at predictive. But if we looked at medicine in terms of research, they actually use simulation quite a bit around predictive. But the two are not linked at all.
Interesting. The psychology does too. But Pip, you had your hand up for a while. Sorry, I missed that. Thanks.
That's okay. I was just listening to what everyone had to say. I was going to say, Jan, I'm from a paramedic background, and I was also a nurse before that. And paramedics, ambulance drivers, ambulance officers, we were never given a seat at the table for many, many years because we were vocationally trained. Our scope broadened very quickly, which is good in some ways and not so great in others. And then that permitted a university sector to take on training, being the primary provider now across the country. So what that allowed us to have a seat with the table. I think the difficulty that I can see with your project is if people can't see it, they can't be it. And if they can't be it, no one can mentor them to be it. So there has to be some kind of representation of people in industry that to do things like this, present at SimCafe or write papers about it as a profession, to build confidence and understanding by other industries that it is a serious profession. And then I think that kind of then rolls into itself. It kind of continues to generate more conversation and therefore more serious, it's been taken in a more serious light. It took paramedicine many years to get to that point, probably too long really, because we didn't look after our young very well. We didn't research and record what we were doing very well. And only just now we might have in the country, I'm just guessing, maybe 100 people who've got a PhD compared to nursing, which is probably more like 5,000 PhDs. And yet the work we do is quite similar and also quite different. So I think it's about generating that production of papers and conversations and presentations that then stimulates more conversation. And so people can see it, so they think, oh, that's something you can be. That's something I could actually do with my life. That's something I'm interested in, rather than it just being an adjunct or a side dish to you being an educator or being an engineer or working in aviation or whatever.
Thanks for those comments.
And
I'm
Pip,
taking that as a comment.
Pip's talking himself into a couple of papers by the end of the year too.
I had the time.
Which is why it's labelled healthcare. Just going back to just a couple of comments made. I think, Marcus, when you talked about that generalisation of the roles, when I spoke to the people that are on the panel, they actually want me to even narrow it more. They would like me to pick just 2 industries and use them as a generalisation. So I think the focus is going to have to be that, and what I've said to them is that I will do the initial across 4, and then if I need to, I'll narrow it then. but I'll look at that first. And I agree with you. It can't talk to everything, but I think this is the groundwork to say, well, if it works for 4 areas, then there's a possibility that it could be more generalised. So that's my thought at the moment. I'm wondering what your thoughts are to that.
I think you're probably right, Jan. The only one where I have some concern is developmental education, so primary and secondary school. And it's, you know, I work with scouts, I work with young kids. They love simulations, they love immersing into it. I just don't know if everything that we do naturally fits into there from these 4 categories. It might, but everything else, the transport, the research, I think there is an overlap from every single one of your 4 you've chosen.
And having said that, the people that were on my panel initially suggested that I should be definitely looking at healthcare and civil aviation because they were so similar. They would be the natural ones. And I'm thinking to myself, but the whole point of this is to actually look at possibly disparate type areas, because then you can draw on similarities from disparate areas, rather than those that are really in their mind similar. So my answer was to say, well, I don't know whether they're similar or not similar yet. This is what I'm looking at. So I feel that it's necessary to look across the board first before making that choice. So it was an interesting discussion to be had.
Yeah. I guess I had a question in that context in terms of including engineering, because I think that's different in a way that the workforce is credentialed and all that kind of stuff. So you can look at it as an analogy, and people who work in simulation come from an engineering background and apply engineering discipline in terms of developing simulators. But I guess it really depends on where your focus is, and it gets back down to question 5 as well, the comment I was going to make. What credentialing would apply? Obviously, you need to define which roles need to be credentialed as part of answering that question, as well as what credentialing would be needed. So I think engineering, yeah, it's important to include it in your top level consideration, but it really depends what angle you're coming from. And one way of looking at that is to consider a discipline in engineering called digital engineering, which is a new buzzword. It's basically using digital twins and digital threads and modeling and simulation-based systems engineering in order to design and sustain more complex systems.
Thanks for that, Phil. Look, I think you're right. One of the thoughts that I had was that if I liken it to the healthcare, you know, you would in just about any degree course with healthcare, you would do a basic healthcare course that will give you a basic understanding, and after that you do need to specialise. And I think in simulation, even though we don't realise it, I don't think we have that core knowledge and skills that we all have an understanding of at this stage. But we specialise anyway, which is kind of interesting. That's my thoughts. You know, you've got your finger up.
Yeah. When you spoke about altruism as the last of the roles of a professional, I was both concerned and happy. I'm taking this a few pages back from here. I think altruism has to be a compulsory feature of any professional, whether a simulation and gaming professional or otherwise, because it enlarges his mind, not so much as his knowledge, connects him up with other people, makes him more tolerant and becomes more empathetic about other people's pains and costs. Some of the ways that a professional could exhibit altruism could be by acting pro bono. I wouldn't say it's working pro bono. Mentoring other people, which I think Marcus has just spoken about some time back. When you mentor and when you act, you also learn. So it's a faster way to learn. Advocating the cause of simulations and games in any which way possible. Coaching new entrants about how to do things faster and better as the more experienced professionals many years ahead of them would have done. writing and speaking for the cause. I think we must do that more often. I think many of us do that. Somehow, I think in some professional bodies, probably it's professionals, or maybe it's the bodies. I think by implication, they find altruism a little embarrassing for them. They don't talk about it. They don't show it. They find it a little reluctant to connect with others. But if it were to be on a material plane, I mean, I'm prepared to be altruistic. What will I get back in return? I think you could probably enlarge the visibility, and you could get more clients. And well, that's a virtuous circle. So maybe I think we should probably deliberately state altruism as probably number 2 or number 3 in the list, as against probably number 5 in your list, Jan. I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Ben. And what you're really saying too is that just that definition of professionalism probably needs a little bit of clarification through part of the case studies, or through the work, because I actually like the thought that was brought up with altruism, that realistically it's training our young as well. That is a part of altruism. Often what we're doing is not being paid. We're just, I mean, you know, and every time we're with our young, we're not being, sometimes you get paid for education for sure, but most of us go above and beyond and just continue, because we do believe in our profession and we do want it improved. So I think that's kind of what you're talking about. But I think you're right. We probably need to get that definitions for each of those points correct, so that there's no ambiguity, because I think that's one of the issues that we've had within our industries.
Yeah. Sorry, I've got to go. I've got another meeting to go to. I was just going to add one more comment in terms of the sense of the profession, and that says recognition of history and acknowledgement of the history of the profession as well. So looking to the future, but building consciously on the past.